I'm Fredrik and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And we are the pushback talks. We are like the team of the pushback talks. We are the pushing back talking people.
Oh my God. We're talking and pushing back and pushing and talking and walking. And no, we're not walking. We're both sitting.
We are trying to be funny, but most of the time just because we're so tired. How are you, Leilani? Are you fine?
Yeah, I'm pretty good.
You've been to London and Barcelona, meeting a lot of your housing folks.
I was meeting some housing folks. There was an international social housing festival in Barcelona, and it was great because it was the first time I'd been to it since COVID. So I saw lots of friends and made some new friends. It was really great, and there was a really good spirit at the conference. Yeah, I met a lot of people who wanted to show push and had shown push in their own local organizations or communities.
That's cool.
Yep.
And should you ask me where I am?
Yeah, where are you, Fredrik? It looks to me like you're in a hotel.
It's in a fancy hotel. Not fancy. I can't open the window. I'm in Sheffield, England. Uh-huh. I'm here for the UK premiere of my new film, Breaking Social.
Great.
And the Sheffield Dog Fest is like the most important dog fest in the UK. So it's good to be here.
I've been there.
You've been there. We were there with Push.
We were.
And now I'm here with Breaking Social. And you remember when we had one of the panels of Push in Sheffield, we had a professor from the University of Sheffield.
We did.
And the panel who actually bought us wine because we couldn't pay.
It's true. She had cash.
Yeah.
And we didn't.
So now she's back. Desiree Fields. Welcome to Pushback Talks. And now you're in sunny California because you moved on to the University of Berkeley. But I got to know you through Leilani. And for you, Desiree Fields is one of the first academics started to talk about financialization. So important person in your work.
Desiree is a superstar and really helped inform my early work on the financialization of housing. So very, very pleased that we get to reunite with Desiree. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I wish I could say that it was sunny here in California, but it's been very gray lately. Hoping for some sunshine later today.
It will come.
Nice to be with you.
It will come. Desiree, now when we're trying to prepare us for this podcast, we are looking to your new research, and there's a lot of interesting names coming up here: the automatic landlord, the digital divide, the prop tech, the real tech, the smart real estate tech, real estate fintech. So there's a lot of things to talk about, but I think we should go back to the financialization, how you were early on it, and that you also in some way concluded now that financialization is also racism. Can you tell us about how you landed in that conclusion?
That financialization is racism?
Yeah.
Sure. So that work, which I did with Eloy Raymond, who's an amazing critical planner based at Georgia Tech, that work emerged kind of out of our shared interest in how the mortgage crisis in the U.S. was, as you two are well familiar, I'm sure, the mortgage crisis was incredibly racialized in the U.S. And by that, I mean that there were racially differentiated kind of channels of mortgage lending that kind of opened up access to mortgage credit to lower income and minority households in ways that hadn't been possible before the 1990s or so. And so that kind of lending, which was higher risk, often had higher interest rates and other kinds of predatory terms, that kind of lending became known as subprime lending, right? To differentiate borrowers who tended to have lower credit scores, fewer financial resources, and so forth, right? And so through subprime lending, we began to see that, that process of opening up access to mortgage credit was very racialized, so that lower income people, Black and brown people were offered access to mortgage credit, but on terms that were more expensive and more punitive. And when the long kind of boom in housing prices began to stall in the mid 2000s, a lot of those people were unable to keep up with their mortgage payments. And so we had seen an incredible growth in home ownership based wealth in the U.S., particularly among households that had been excluded from access to that kind of wealth for many generations, before that. And we saw, basically the destruction of all of that wealth in the aftermath of the crisis. And so Elora and I were kind of thinking about that, and her work at the time dealt more with kind of negative equity, mortgage lending. My work dealt more with how financial actors were trying to kind of reconstruct the link between finance and real estate after the crisis. And that work led me to look at rental housing, right? And how kind of that was the new frontier for financialization. And, we wanted to kind of set these developments in a longer historical context. It's my, my kind of observation of a lot of the research around the crisis is that we spent a long time, probably a decade or more, a long time after the crisis, trying to put it together. Like, what were the causes of the crisis? What was the fallout? What happened afterwards, right? And I think the piece that I did with Elora on racialized geographies of housing financialization was also trying to do that, but also trying to kind of put these developments around how the crisis was racialized, trying to put them in a longer historical context that really said, look, this is not the first time that we have seen racial difference be the kind of axis of housing inequality, of wealth inequality, and so forth, right? And we also wanted to kind of put a little bit of a challenge to the scholarship on housing financialization, which we saw often kind of like dealt with race as a kind of variable rather than as like a fundamental dimension of the process. So in that sense, we were kind of working with scholarship on racial capitalism and also working with scholarship on housing financialization, urban political economy, so David Harvey, Manuel Albers, et cetera, but trying to put that together with thinkers like Cedric Robinson and Stuart Hall to get a sense of how racial difference becomes the logic through which financialized accumulation develops.
This is really interesting. And I think an aspect that is not really so well known. I mean, I think of The Big Short, Adam McKay's film Big Short, that tells like how lucrative it was at one point to sell these mortgages to people who never had access to credit before, and how in some way they lured them and they lost their homes. Suddenly they had to rent their own homes to a much higher amount. Totally crazy. Leilani, what is your reflections?
I think it's such an important aspect to all of this. And certainly whenever I'm in the U.S. and I'm talking about financialization or meeting with tenants who are experiencing financialization and really suffering now, it's always racialized communities, Black and brown, Native Americans, et cetera. And so the work that you've done to expose this or to help expose this, Desiree, is super important. And just that simple idea that people just don't think about. I mean, redlining, as they called it, historically in the U.S., which prevented Black people from owning homes in neighborhoods across the U.S., the ripple-on effect of that, the capture of a racialized population who are not owners, and then pre-global financial crisis, the opportunity suddenly to become owners, the American dream, right? And home ownership is so important in the U.S., or has been so important, especially when viewed in light of the fact that social housing doesn't exist practically anymore. And, the idea of a foothold in the property market is a foothold in being able to give something to your children, right? It's inheritance, et cetera. So just to say, I think what you've exposed in your work is really vital to the work around financialization, that we are in the area of equality. That's what we're talking about, inequality and equality.
But I mean, this kind of financialization is racism could also be put on top of a country like my own country, Sweden, where the Blackstones and the hedge fund moved in and bought poor people's homes and pushed up the rents. And it's basically the people who live there in these areas are also racialized.
Yeah.
So it's in some way it has the same effect here, or also in the UK where I'm right now,
and in Canada too. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not even about home ownership. It's also about they're putting this weight on top of our homes, and they're bringing a lot of stress into society, and this divide that we're talking about is growing, and the stress and the frustration is growing a lot.
No, I think that's right. The places, the neighborhoods, the communities that are associated with, in the U.S., Black, Brown, and Indigenous populations are often cast as sort of underdeveloped, in need of redevelopment, right? And then it becomes an opportunity to kind of like build value for investors. And I'm really glad to hear you. I mean, not glad, but it's gratifying to hear you say that you see similar kinds of processes playing out in Sweden or in the UK or Canada, because even just a couple of years ago, kind of sharing this work with people in the UK, there was a tendency to kind of say, but that's the US, right? And like, that's a special case. And I think, if we look to, some of the great scholars on racial capitalism, like Ruth Gilmore or Cedric Robinson, right? One of the fundamental insights of that scholarship is that, that these kinds of racial hierarchies, were playing out within Europe even before the onset of global colonialism or the transatlantic slave trade, right? And that they're not, that they play out in specific ways in the US, but that, we see the same kinds of racial hierarchies, being constructed everywhere that there's capitalism. And so it's really interesting to me how that insight is kind of taking hold a little bit more compared to a few years ago, where it was very, very easy for scholars outside of the US to say, that's just you all over there. But, we British, like, we abolished slavery before everyone else. And so we're, our hands are clean, right?
Maybe not.
Yeah. But just to say, I mean, the business model as it plays out in Canada, for example, is the big financial actors are buying multi-family, apartment buildings. And the business model is one where they're searching for the most affordable places, because that's where they've got the biggest margins that they can play with and raise rents and fees, et cetera. And of course, who's living often in those most affordable units? It's the poorest people, the people with the least income, which in Canada is invariably racialized communities, Indigenous peoples, migrants, refugees. So, it's they can say, well, it's not purposeful. We're just, implementing our business model. But all they need to do is reflect on who is affected by their business model, who's living in the buildings, and it's those communities. So there's a way in which it's I don't want to be legalese about it, but directly discriminatory, on its face.
Desiree, you've been working on a lot of other things, and we're really curious to hear about talk about the platforms, how they moved into and changed the housing market, or changed the cities even. I mean, I know you've been looking into the biggest one, Airbnb and Uber. How did you go about this?
Well, I personally don't really focus that much on Airbnb and Uber, but I became really interested. I actually wasn't that interested in digital technologies initially, but as I began to focus on this kind of post-2008 movement of private equity and institutional investors into the single-family housing market in the U.S., this was sort of after the crisis, right? And so I was really interested in like, okay, what happens now? There's all these houses that are undervalued, and mortgage credit had tightened back up again. It was very clear that, people weren't going to be buying these homes. So it turned out to be a great opportunity for players like Blackstone to acquire property on the cheap and and rent it out. But that business model was really unproven, right? So in the US, single family homes have often been rented. I grew up in a single family rental home. My parents didn't own the home. But what we saw was these big players began to kind of like at scale, buy thousands of homes and rent them out. And what I was learning as I was attending investment forums and talking to people who were kind of operating in this space was that technology was sort of the key to being able to execute this business model. So at the same time as we, were kind of entering and contending with the 2008 crisis, there was also this incredible takeoff of digital technologies, right? So we began to see, this is like around the time that Airbnb and Uber were kind of like getting up and running, right? And so we saw these big investors really begin to exploit the capabilities of these technologies like algorithms, machine learning, big data, all of that, to do things like build algorithms to bid on properties, right? So they would build these kind of acquisition algorithms that would allow them to basically scan the market really quickly, develop bids and submit offers really quickly so that they can, they could put an offer on a house, within a few hours of it hitting the listing service. So enabling them to kind of outcompete other players. And they also made a lot of use of kind of portals and platforms and things like that to kind of interface with tenants. Because of course, if you're operating thousands and thousands of rental homes, you're not going to really be having personal interactions with your tenants, right? And so, we begin to see things like tenants having to pay their rent online, submit maintenance tickets online, and often kind of being enrolled into performing some of the home maintenance labor themselves, right? And so,
is this the automated landlord?
Yeah, so this is like how I began to think about the idea of the automated landlord, and I also think something that all of these developments have done is like kind of in a weird way like dissolve the figure of the landlord, because it's not like one person, right? It's if we're thinking about Invitation Homes, right? It's a huge, corporation. It's also shareholders, right? It's also, maybe my pension fund, right? So it's pensioners. So we have this really like disaggregated figure of the landlord, but at the same time, the point of contact for tenants is really, a platform or a portal. And the kind of the rental experience is really governed through these different forms of technologies. Yeah. So I think, as I've been kind of continuing work in this space, I've also been kind of interested in how newer platforms kind of began to roll out that were positioning themselves in relation to the big institutional investors. And so they'll say things like, institutional investors, exploited advances in technology to create new investment opportunities. And we're doing the same thing for the little guy, and you too can invest in rental housing. And so we see these kind of fractional investment platforms coming out that allow people to be, 1/100th of a landlord or 1/200th of a landlord. So you buy a share of a rental property.
Well, that's because I've seen that in art business. You can buy like a part of a Monet. Yeah. You're part of a Picasso, you can
exactly.
And of course, once I was in a shop to buy or fix my phone, the guy in the shop was like, what he was busy doing. He said, "What are you doing?" "Yeah, I'm buying and selling currencies." Yeah. So people are like, I mean, they've managed to send a message to people that they can kind of outsmart capitalism or be a part of it and so on.
I think be a part of it. The assetization, complete assetization of housing, right? You can just, you don't have to have the headache of managing housing. You can just purchase it on your phone, just purchase a portion. You're still a real estate owner that way, and you don't have to be a landlord. And it's quite scary. I actually think Amazon has a real estate arm. Am I not? Am I making this up? I recall reading in the last couple of years a similar kind of thing where they get fractional ownership. No, Desiree, you're the expert.
I don't know. I'm trying to think about that. I mean, they certainly own data centers for Amazon Web Services, and I'm not sure if they must own some of like their warehouses and things like that. And I know like Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, he kind of has an investment company, and he actually his investment company helped back one of these new fractional investment platforms called Arrived Homes.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that might be what you're thinking of.
I think that's what I'm thinking of. Exactly.
But I think it's sometimes it's very hard to understand how people like Blackstone, why they are so successful all the time. Mm-hmm. And I tried to explain it for myself, like they're so good in this kind of data mining, or to kind of have they have so many tentacles. They really can feel what's cooking on the planet. And we've talked about it before, that they suddenly are into buying all the warehouse, since the container crisis now, they are now boom everywhere. In my town, they bought a lot of the warehouses. And so it's like they understand much sooner than the local businessmen in my town would understand that this value is coming. And of course, and when they enter, very often they enter and paying much more than people ask for even. So in some way they push up the value.
That's right.
Which is like, it's hard to understand how they do it. But it is about this, the prop tech you're talking about, the real tech, the real estate, fintech. They have these kind of tools to understand, and of course also to push the market their way in some ways.
Yeah, no, they definitely have access to, of course, like all of the data and the analysts and all of that at their fingertips. They also have access to a lot of capital, right? So, the old, information is power, knowledge is power, right? So they have like all of the information plus lots of capital. And so for actors like Blackstone, a crisis is really an opportunity, right? Because a crisis means undervalued assets. And so, I would not be surprised if, given what's going on in commercial real estate markets. So, I'm based in the Bay Area. San Francisco has, I think, something like a 24% vacancy rate in its office real estate. And it's kind of like the lowest number of people kind of like moving around downtown of kind of like major cities that are being tracked for the recovery of their downtown area since the pandemic. So I wouldn't be surprised if Blackstone moves into office real estate aggressively and or retail, right? So the big shopping mall in downtown San Francisco just announced that they're turning them all back over to their creditors quite soon, right? And so the way that the pandemic has kind of affected the commercial and retail real estate markets, I wouldn't be surprised if Blackstone is moving into those markets aggressively, right? Mm-hmm. And also where they sense kind of I don't want to attribute kind of like villainous attributes to Blackstone, but where you get a sense of like desperation. So for example, Blackstone cashed out of its holdings in Invitation Homes, which is, the biggest single family rental landlord in the country. They cashed out of their stake in that company, I think around 2018 or 2019. And they bought a rent to own company called Home Partners of America, kind of maybe right before or right at the beginning of the pandemic. And, of course, we all know there was a huge real estate boom in the US during the pandemic. People were looking for more space, more privacy, et cetera. And so, we had this situation where real estate demand shot up tremendously. Interest rates were really low. And that looked like a good play for a rent to own company, which, essentially buys homes, rents them out to people for a few years, and then sells it, ostensibly sells it to the tenant so that they can become a homeowner. So rent to own looked like a really good play for Blackstone at that point in the pandemic. And I think now with the kind of, the toll of inflation and rising interest rates, I think they're, starting to pull back a little bit on that model. So I'm starting to talk to people who are users of rent-to-own platforms. And one of the things they're saying is that companies like Home Partners of America are submitting really lowball offers on homes. And I think that has a lot to do with, their need to kind of create profit in these investments. So yeah, I think when there's a sense of desperation or impending crisis, I think that's when actors like Blackstone really like zoom in and move.
Because it's also this kind of, I think that's also a way of understanding them, is that they are actually very good at also moving out. Because Leilani, you made a report about the Swedish Akelius company. Well, Akelius is based in Cyprus and Bahamas, but they're a Swedish owner. But they sold everything they had in Sweden and in Germany. And now the people came after, Heimstaden, who is like Norwegian Swedish. They are now stuck when the interest rate goes up. So they are like in deep shit suddenly. But Akelius moved on. Yeah. So,
that's right.
So it seems like some of these players are like they really know when to move out.
I mean, I would say that's like the private equity model, right? Is the kind of like knowing when to enter, knowing when to exit. And the tech model too, right? So the tech model is also this kind of this pivot, right? So like one business model looks like it's not quite working out. And so you kind of use all of the data that you've kind of gathered and extracted through operating the platform. And you kind of figure out through analyzing the data, okay, like here's like a business model we can pivot to that will be profitable or will bring in revenues. Sorry, I think say something.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that I've noticed Blackstone moving into the affordable housing space. I mean, like the really affordable housing space. They did that in Spain. We saw that after the global financial crisis. But they're doing it, for example, in the U.S. They bought something like 66 apartment complexes in San Diego, and those are under an affordable housing scheme. They're doing so in the United Kingdom. They're not called Blackstone there; they're called Sage, but it is affordable housing. And because they're so non-transparent, it can be difficult to figure out what are they up to with that housing, and where are they going to get their gains from, right? And it's so difficult for tenants to challenge that because, as you say, they have access to all sorts of data that helps them figure out how they're going to make that profit. So a little troubling that's the space they're moving into, and they're moving there. It's, everyone's clamoring about the need for more affordable housing because every city around the world is unaffordable. And so Blackstone is just a chameleon then, right? Then they're like, oh, that's us. We can save the planet. We can save everyone we're going to invest in affordable housing. It's pretty scary.
Yeah. And I think they're kind of, Blackstone is particularly interesting because they are actually everywhere in the rental market across the entire life course, right? So they own multifamily, they own affordable multifamily, they own student housing, senior housing,
manufactured
single-family homes, manufactured homes,
mobile homes,
mobile homes, extended stay hotel, right? Like they have like covered the spectrum. And then as we were just talking about, they kind of can enter and exit those investments as it suits their bottom line.
Yeah.
So, Leilani and Desiree, we are really bringing our listeners down when we talk about these big guys. So, is there any hope? Can we fight back? How do you see that, Desiree? How should we structure the pushback?
I mean, I think there's a lot of hope in like the tenants unions that have been forming around the U.S. So I find the work of the Los Angeles Tenants Union really inspiring, the work of the Kansas City Tenants Union, the Veritas Tenants Union, which is based in San Francisco, and they're a group of tenants that are fighting back against Veritas, which is another corporate landlord based here. And so I find, this kind of effort to scale up tenant organizing to the level of the portfolio or to the, to the corporate structure of the landlord. I find, all of that incredibly inspiring, because I think, the US and many other places have, these strong and illustrious histories of kind of labor unions, right? And organizing on the shop floor, right? And I think, what we're seeing in terms of the crisis of rental affordability, which is longstanding in the US, but has grown much more acute in recent years. I think we see, that struggles are not only organized around, kind of the point of production, but the point of reproduction in our communities, right? And, so to see tenants organizing at that scale, I think is really important work. And I think we should, be doing everything we can to support that level of collective organizing.
I think your work is really important. That's exactly what we experienced when we've been traveling with Push, is that this kind of knowledge that we can bring on the table is really helpful when people are organized and they start to argue.
Yeah.
And this is not a US thing, because, we had Push playing in Mexico, and we also work together with the tenant unions there, or the tenant unions in Sweden or in Germany. It's really a global struggle. And knowledge is very much, it's an important part of this, to understand how they are organized. And your work is then really important. Also Leilani's work, of course, because you're great at making it clear what we should ask for.
Well, and we talk about it from the point of view at the Shift of human rights harms caused by this. It's not, I don't care what business model is out there. What I care about is the impact it's having on people, in this case, tenants, and the fact that it is violative of human rights, which are things that governments have agreed to uphold, even in the United States, but certainly across Europe. So for me, it's, we know there will be no change unless tenants start acting collectively and pushing back. For sure, change always comes from the ground. We know that. And so what I'm really enjoying seeing is there has been more of a recognition by tenants themselves that what they're fighting for are their human rights, human right to adequate, decent, secure, affordable housing. And that's, for me, that's been a change I've seen. And I wish I could be given credit for that. It's not me. It's just the times, I think. But there's been an evolution around that, I find, where more and more tenants are saying, wait a second, like housing's a fundamental human right, and I'm being denied that right. I don't know if you're seeing that in the US-based advocacy, because human rights have their particularities there.
I don't know that, I'm not sure that I'm seeing exactly that. I think some of the other developments, though, that I think I'm starting to see. So one is this kind of expansive definition of tenants that some of the tenants unions that I mentioned are starting to use, right? So they're not just thinking about tenants as people who are renting from landlords, but tenants as anyone who lacks control over their housing situation. And through that kind of broader definition, the LA Tenants Union, for example, is working closely with unhoused communities, right? And showing up to do eviction defenses at encampments and things like that. And I think building that kind of solidarity across the differentiated group of people who lack control over their housing is really important. And it builds sort of common cause between groups that might not always see themselves as in, having shared commitments and shared struggles. And the other thing that I think is really important, because you talked, Leilani, about how Blackstone is kind of also a black box, right? And how it's so hard to know what they're doing and what they're up to. The other thing that is happening a lot in the US, and I think starting to happen in other places, although it's challenging, especially in places like Germany, but is trying to use some of the same, databases and platforms and, digital technologies to basically gain more transparency over property ownership. So you have projects like Evictor Book, which the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project started in San Francisco and Oakland. You have Who Owns What in New York City, and all kinds of little grassroots efforts that are basically trying to put some power in tenants' hands to know who actually owns the building that I live in. What other properties do they own? What is their track record on evictions and housing code violations? So kind of, as tenants, and I'm still a renter here in the Bay Area, right? As tenants, like, we are asked to give up so much information about ourselves when we rent, right? All of the forms we have to fill out, the insight into our, credit and financial history. And meanwhile, we might not even know who we're paying rent to, really, right? And so I think these efforts to kind of unmask corporate ownership structures is really important.
We've done a few episodes with data journalists, mapping journalists, one in Athens, remember, Leilani, but also from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
this kind of deeper research into who owns my building.
Yeah.
And
Cities for Rent. Journalists who did the Cities for Rent series.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also in Croatia, we talk to people like that. So and they have to track the ownership back in 8-9 steps to find who they are. And even then it's kind of hard. My new film, Breaking Social, is looking into also the breaking of the social contract in a wider context, and the divide in society. And I think this is that conversation is now growing here in the UK. Is huge. Everybody talks about poverty and the stress people feel if they're homeowners or renters. Doesn't really matter. People are super stressed because they have hard times to pay the rent and the salary is not going up. And so this, and still we can see, I mean, Oxfam, we had Oxfam in our previous show the last week, and 2/3 of all wealth produced since 2020 went to the 1%. 2/3, it's so absurd. So, and then of course we can see that the Blackstones and all these guys, they belong to this 1%. So we need to find a way to turn that around, because the stress is also creating racism and it's feeding a lot of frustration.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big challenge, but so we need to find ways. And of course, your work is important and Leilani's work is important.
And yours too, Fredrik.
Oh,
we need films. We need films.
Yeah.
It moves
it's
people.
true. I mean, arts and culture play such an important role in building public awareness and kind of reaching people at an emotional and affective level.
And it bridges people. It bridges people. You get this audience, an audience made up of all sorts of walks of life, right? Young, old, students, people who own, people who rent, people who are homeless, whatever. And suddenly they're unified through the film, right? It's pretty cool. I
talked to the audience today here in Sheffield, and I said, it's like the big battle is not really between left or right. It's like between decent and not decent. Yeah. It's
so true. Yeah.
So it's of course you can debate capitalism and everything. I mean, we Leilani, you say, yes, you can have capitalism, but it has to respect human rights and it has to respect the planet. Then you can have your capitalism. It might be difficult, but it's I think that's fair. We can. Yeah. I think what this Oxfam model shows us is that we could have quite a broad coalition going against this crazy development, because 99% are on the losing side of it.
Yeah. Well, I always thought if we could unite tenants or people living in informality, people living in homelessness, if we could, unite all of them globally, that would be a force to be reckoned with.
But Desiree, I know you have to shoot out to.
I do.
With your kids or with something work-oriented?
I have another meeting, yeah.
Fair enough.
So it's really cool to connect again. And it's nice to see you. It looks sunny from here. I mean, our listeners can't see it anyway, but it's I hope we can connect again. And I hope I will come to the Bay Area to show my film, so we can meet and then you have.
And I'll be next year in Uppsala, Sweden for the year.
Oh,
so
wow,
yeah,
wow. That's great.
Then it's
I got
easier.
a fellowship there. So yeah, pop by anytime.
That's cool. Okay. Thank you very much, and see you later. Bye.
All right, take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
So Leilani, this was really cool. It's we constantly learn things from people like that.
It's really cool. I was thinking, the internet, data, all of that. There's a way in which it's sold to us as being a great equalizer, right? We all have access to Google. We all have access to Alexa and Siri. And this episode shows us how data, like so many other things, is creating more divides, more inequality. Anyway, just musing.
Yeah, we might use data to turn things around also. So
Yeah.
But Leilani,
Yes.
this was again a new episode. And it's cool.
It was.
So do we need to tell our listeners that we have something called Patreon, which is a way of supporting our show?
Yeah, let's tell them.
If you like what we do, if you think we deserve to be able to pay the bills, you can support us. And how please tell.
They just go to patreon.com and look for Pushback Talks. You can support us with just a little bit of money or a whole lot.
Yeah.
Every little bit helps.
That's cool. And if you're curious about my new film, Breaking Social, you can check it out on the website, breakingsocialfilm.com, or in the social media accounts of Breaking Social, and check out the trailer and check out if it's coming close to you soon, because it will be out on theaters around many countries this year. But maybe if it's not in your country, you can write to us and say, come on, I want to take part. I want to show the film. And organize a debate with my friends and my peers.
Cool.
And I think we should find, we will have a theatrical release also in Canada. So Leilani, you will have to host a screening.
I'll be there. I'll host.
You will be the host.
I'll do what I can.
And then you will have to invite me for a glass of wine.
Absolutely. Always.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. So that was it.
That's it.
So I'm going out into the documentary film world here in Sheffield, and you will walk your dog. That's like how life is organized.
Something like that. It's sunny and warm here. I'm going to go sit outside.
That's good. Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye, Fredrik.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Follow us on social media at make_the_shift and at push_the_film. Or check out our websites, maketheshift.org, pushthefilm.com, or breakingsocialfilm.com.